Good morning, Oklahoma. Welcome to Cow-Calf Corner. Well, as we continue to deal with issues that are drought and heat related right now, really not just in Oklahoma, but on a nationwide basis, I've had questions in recent weeks about the possibility of retained ownership from some cow-calf operations that have historically sold weaned calves or maybe used cool season grass and turned them into yearlings. So this week we addressed 5 considerations, or kind of 5 categories, if you will, to consider if you're thinking about retained ownership. First thing, if we're looking at retained ownership, it's based on low cow inventories, fewer amounts of calves and fed cattle being marketed in the future. We're looking at backing up our marketing endpoint to a time when we anticipate the prices will be better. So what should we consider if we look at doing this? First, realize if we're going to retain ownership and actually be selling fed cattle, in the modern beef industry, the vast majority of fed cattle are sold on a carcass value basis. That's not to say that this doesn't vary a little bit by region and you can't still potentially sell some live, but the majority of cattle are priced on a carcass value basis. Now, what does that mean? Basically, we take our finished cattle, they're harvested, a USDA grader is going to come in and assign quality grades and yield grades, and optimum combinations of quality and yield grades, say something that is better than a low choice yield grade 3, are going to be up for premiums or better than average market prices, and poorer combinations are going to be in for discounts and penalties. We're going to sell those on a price per pound of carcass. There's also the potential, if we have carcasses that are too heavy or too light, we take some discounts there. Second thing we ought to consider is the opportunity cost on that money. If we've historically sold weaned calves and we hang on to those rascals longer, we are looking at volatility in markets. We're looking at potential death loss that we haven't dealt with at earlier marketing endpoints. And so there's a new set of considerations there to think about as we look long-term and finishing out those cattle. Next thing I would consider is, do you have any data that tells you how your cattle have done after you've sold them in the past, or particularly how your calves have done? If you've historically sold weaned calves or yearlings, have you gotten any feedback on what the death loss or the cost of gain or the pull rate for health issues or potentially those quality grades, yield grades, carcass weights, finish weights on those calves? Have you got any data that tells you some stuff as far as what you can anticipate there? Next thing I would consider, and another factor in here economically, the same drought that's impacting us and causing us to liquidate cows is impacting the grain growing parts of the United States. Feed grains are historically high. The cost of gain associated with finishing out cattle in the future is going to be historically high as well. It's going to be a lot more than what we've typically had in those cattle. Say we were turning weaned calves into yearlings. And if we fed some cattle out years ago, I'd anticipate that we're looking at a lot higher cost of gains on finished cattle than what we were in years past. Another thing to consider is, where have we typically put selection pressure whenever we were buying bulls? And if you have, for the past 5-10 years, put some selection pressure on post-weaning growth, carcass traits, things like marbling, ribeye size, fat thickness, and you've been retaining daughters out of those bulls, and they are now in production and raising calves sired by more bulls that have had that kind of selection pressure put on them, then retained ownership through finishing is potentially a means to capture additional value out of some of that investment in genetics that you've made. If you've been putting selection pressure in other places, we need to take that into account. Well, this is part 1 of a series on considerations for retained ownership. Next week, or in weeks to come, we're going to get more into grids and how they work and talk specifically about quality grades and yield grades and what they're based on. But thanks for joining us this week on Cow-Calf Corner.